come off mute and, oh, I totally forgot to do that. Thank you. This will be recorded, sorry. But in doing so, feel free to come off mute and say that out loud or drop it into the chat. Oh, sorry.
Also, I guess before we get started, so Elaine is relatively new to Expanded School. So she joins us from San Jose, California, originally, or I guess like that's where she was working with youth before she was working with us. And she has a lot of great experience implementing youth adult partnerships and youth participatory action research. So any questions that you might have, she's an amazing resource. So even after this, if you have any other questions, sorry to volunteer you.
No, you're
You
good.
can also ask me or Jacques, but Elaine is really, it's like she knows this stuff back to front. So yeah.
That's very kind of you. I probably should have included that. Apologies. But yes, the last 3 years I was working at a nonprofit leading YPAR work. So that's partially why I was tapped for this particular webinar. And as we go through this process, if you have questions that come up, we will have free to drop this in the chat as well. And we have a Jamboard link that you can also drop questions into, which I believe Adam will put into the chat. Yes, cool. But yes, so those are our introductions. And moving on into our icebreaker. And talking about YPAR and youth stepping into power, we kind of wanted to start by being a bit reflective about ourselves when we were youth and think about a time when you were a youth, when you felt powerful or empowered, just as a way of like setting the space and thinking about youth that you interact with. And so I know that in answering this question, power itself can be defined and expressed in a lot of different ways. So feel free to go as big or as small as you like, but as you have about a minute to think that through, feel free to drop that into the chat or share aloud if you like. And if it's helpful, Adam and I can also give our own examples. So in that case, I can kick us off. Something that came to mind for me was actually something that's very simple. It is kind of riding through my neighborhood on my bicycle. So I kind of like going full speed ahead and like feeling the power that I had and driving that momentum forward and feeling the road around me. Just in that, like, I felt very strong in being able to go that fast and to feel the wind in my face and things like that. So that's my particular example. But as you think through yours, as again, feel free to go as big or as small or as random as you'd like. You can use the chat or come off mute.
Hi. So I loved performing as a kid. I loved being on the stage. So I was in a after-school program called the PAL, and they used to have these showcases, seasonal showcases. And one year, I was like, mind you, let me come off. I was born in the late 80s, so it was weird for the song that I picked, but I picked to sing like Aretha Franklin Respect. And I feel like I killed that performance, and I think I was like 8 or 9. And that's one of my favorite like childhood moments. I just took over the stage, and yeah.
It's a great song choice. It's very impressive.
Thanks.
Saw a comment in the chat about cooking for yourself. So simple things like making boiled eggs. Absolutely, yes. Can we get one more?
When I was a senior in high school, I was one of 2 females in like a tech program. And we, for our senior project, the 2 of us designed a full day event for 8th grade girls to get them introduced to technology, coding, building computers, all of that. And we called it No Boys Allowed, so NBA for the for the acronym. And we pulled the whole thing off and had a whole big event.
Awesome. And thank you all for sharing. Hopefully that gave you some time to think about your personal experiences and kind of reflect on what you experience as a youth and how you want to then drive experiences for youth that you interact with. But having done that, oh, there's another someone. There's someone else wanting to share, or is that just an accidental unmute? Okay, I'll consider that accidental. But having shared that, we now want to actually ask you about how you and your organizations are working with youth. So many of you are likely interested in facilitating a YPAR structure. And so I'm thinking through the different stages of where you all may be in terms of gearing up for that, prepping, or even actual delivery. It would be great to hear the ways in which you currently engage with youth and how you think it may or may not support YPAR through one of the following 2 questions. So 1, how do you work with youth? And 2, how are you looking to work with youth? Essentially, you're trying to ask, like, what are you doing? Does that match what you want to be doing? And if not, what do you want to do instead? So are there ways that you're interacting with youth that you think support YPAR right now?
I think also if you don't know, I guess really what YPAR is, and this is your introduction, you can also talk about like what drew you to sign up for this in the first place. Like what I guess are your goals for working with youth?
Okay. So where are you interested in? Yeah. And again, feel free to come off mute or put that in the chat. So similar to what Adam said, if you're not sure about YPAR specifically, are there just general ways in which you're interacting with youth that you think could transition to supporting like youth ownership in your programmatic spaces? Or are there particular ways of interacting with youth that you want to get to in order to kind of facilitate that process? Or that's a matter of like recruitment, a matter of like providing or of including particular activities, or kind of having more points for youth voice and youth agency in the programs? Just a general thought of how you view your current programmatic structures. If there's nothing coming to mind, that's okay. We'll be talking a bit about different structures that support the that kind of pivot on the next slide. And some of those structures are, or get some of those pillars that support those structures, or that support that build. Oh, sorry. Was there a comment in the chat that I missed?
Oh, yep, a couple just came in.
Oh, okay, perfect. So one comment is about having more youth agency in programs. So where youth are able to be self-driven and self-sufficient. Another one is about teaching them how to manage and control their emotions and how to grow as individuals. Thank you. Yeah. So that ties in exactly into our organizational pillars of culture, structure, and climate. As this kind of alludes to lots of different ways in which you can interact with youth so as to support them and meet them where they're at. And it's often influenced by one of these 3 pillars: culture, structure, and climate. Culture being the values, beliefs, and patterns of relationships that characterize an organization. Structure being the systems of authority and the methods by which organizations function. And climate being the way individual people in that organization behave and express their feelings and attitudes. Depending on how an organization structures these 3 things and how they are kind of put together, that will drive the way in which they interact with youth in one of 3 ways.
Yeah, and so I think another concept too that flows into the organizational pillars is the spectrum of adult attitudes when working with youth. So it kind of goes on, I guess, a ladder or a hierarchy. So at the lowest level, it would be youth as objects. So adults know what's best for young people, and so they tell them what to do, kind of thing. There's no real back and forth, there's no input. And then kind of in the middle is youth as recipients. So adults make most of the decisions, but they let young people make some of the more trivial ones, or one of the, I guess, the smaller ones. And then at the highest level, it'd be youth as partners. So adults respecting young people as having something significant to offer, and creating an environment that encourages and supports their full involvement. And so I feel like each of these pillars really also upholds those.
Absolutely, yeah. They drive the ways in which you're able to actually interact with the youth that you're working with. So kind of in thinking through that a bit more, we're going to take some time to Jamboard different aspects of culture, structure, and climate that would support the positive engagement of youth. I've just dropped that link into the chat, so feel free to open it up and sticky note some examples that come to mind for you, either personally, organizationally, that directly support or correlate to those things, or drop in some things that you think would support that in the future, or that you're trying to get towards doing as an organization. Take about maybe 2 or 3 minutes to do so, and then come back and debrief and talk through what popped up for folks.
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time before we go back to the breakout room? Or go into the assignment?
Yeah, so what we're gonna do is Adam dropped the Jamboard link into the chat. So what we're gonna have people do is actually go into the Jamboard and sticky note different examples of culture, structure, and climate that they think would support being able to interact with youth as partners. So moving away from youth as objects and recipients, what can you do in order to get to that stage of seeing them as partners and being able to support them positively?
Sure, can you put your definitions back up?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
So it looks like we're starting to get a good number of Post-it notes coming in. As you are typing in your Post-it notes, Are there any that you saw that stood out or that you agreed with? Kind of like a aha moment, if you would. If nothing in particular stood out, are there things here that you agree with because they're things that you are also doing with at your organization? So things that you want to like upvote or like check mark, so to speak. Yeah, feel free to go in and add those in as well, like a visual representation. Seeing a check mark on valuing you time by offering stipends, volunteer hours, or credit for participating. Under structure, another one under structure for inviting them to create programming schedule around their interests. Yeah, I would also add, if possible, for your program, any that you're working with, if it's possible to actually take into account youth schedules. I don't know exactly what the setting is for all your individual programs, but sometimes the scheduling of something can interfere with the youth's ability to participate in it if it comes to something else. So if it's possible to actually keep that into account, it's also a great way of supporting structure. Seeing under culture, check marks on a culture of collaboration, as well as under climate, a safe and supportive climate to allow you to express themselves, being joyous and celebratory, provide lots of encouragement, being race-based style, which is all great. Is there anything here that you like to tap someone to expand upon a bit further? Like, there's something here that's listed that you're still knowing more about that someone could potentially offer to expand on? Or does all it make sense and it tracks very well? Cool. I don't know, Adam, something stood out for you that you wanted to add, or it was all like niches?
Yeah, I really like the contributions, like the under climate, asking you to share the ideas about what they think a good climate would be, and like providing a forum for you to contribute ideas. I feel like so often, like especially younger kids, they don't necessarily get asked these kinds of things all the time. I feel like they catch on a lot more than I think many people give them credit for. I'm sure we all know this having worked with kids, but I think that it's so important to sort of gather that feedback and let them have a say. So I think that's great and perfectly in line with this too.
Absolutely. And a great way of doing that is actually incorporating the use of community agreements into your program, like in the opening of your program. So kind of like working with you to determine kind of like rules of engagement for interacting with each other and the expectations that you have for being in space together. So how you expect someone to treat you, how you want to treat others, I think was saying really helpful in terms of setting like a climate that is supportive for youth who are participating with you. Begin, pause, running like last minute ads. So quick, 1, 2, 3, and then we can now move on into actual opening of YPAR. Apologies. Did a very weird thing. Keeps opening it again. Clicking the wrong spot, sorry. But yes. So what is YPAR?
Is the audio, I guess, under the screen sharing options?
It should be, yes, let me check, confirm. Could people not hear the video?
I couldn't hear it, no.
What it probably is, hold on, let me. Can we hear now? Okay.
Something that's really special at YPAR is how each of our own personal experiences is really appreciated and respected in our projects.
YPAR is a space where we can talk about all the issues that are really important to us.
I leave every single meeting with my mind blown, just like needing like hours to just sit down and say like, oh my goodness, I learned so much that I care so much about today.
A lot of research about students is done by people who aren't students. That aren't fine with the story.
There's more equal ground, and I feel independent and not being told or directed.
It's really hard for students and people who are younger to be able to be heard and to be able to make change.
YPAR's kind of given us the tools to be able to discuss these issues and have conversations with administration and with teachers who would otherwise have power over us.
Awesome. Okay, yeah, I think that was a good kickoff for what youth participatory action research is. And so I guess to go a little bit further into it, so YPAR is just one specific type of youth adult partnership. And so for parts of this, we're going to be talking specifically about YPAR, and other times we're going to be focusing more broadly on all kinds of youth adult partnerships. And one of the key focuses here is to empower youth to define issues and also to investigate them. And so this is based in a social justice framework. And it really focuses on using youth strengths. So you can see over in the Common Foundations part, so youth voice and youth power, those are going to be big pieces of this. So really like highlighting and upholding examples where youth were able to take agency and create real change. The isms, so things like racism, sexism, and also like phobia, like homophobia, as just some examples. And also adultism. So this belief that adults know what's best all the time. So these are common things that YPAR seeks to challenge. Also forms of oppression, so things like ideological, institutional, interpersonal, those are things that YPAR also seeks to dismantle. And one way it does this is through power and power structures. So it helps, I guess, outline to students kind of where power lies in their community and how they can become empowered. So for example, like a power structure, I guess, would be like the school, and there are people who are in power, like the administrators, and then there are people who are least in power, like students, and sort of helping them to understand kind of like in their community, where these things fall, where does power lie, and how can they use their power to make a change. And also community mapping. So that's figuring out which resources exist in the community, like which strengths does your community have a lot of, and then how can you access them, or how would you be able to? And so I guess focusing more on strengths rather than deficits. And so overall, it's the main goal will be to get kids involved in their community and make them feel more connected to their community as a whole.
Exactly. And there are a lot of considerations that can go into developing and implementing a YPAR structure. Some of them are listed here as questions to reflect upon and self-evaluate as an organization. A lot of it comes down to the purpose, like, and the intention you have in mind for the group and the organization's capacity to actually do those things based upon their own beliefs and values, timelines that may be in place, and potential objectives and expectations, both for the group and from youth who are in the group. In the coming slides, we'll do a step-by-step walkthrough that'll help illuminate why these questions in particular. But before we move on, are there any here that kind of stand out that you'd like us to expand upon? Okay. So essentially when you're thinking about a YPAR structure, you want to determine what's your purpose for creating this program. Is there a particular reason that you have in mind for involving youth in something? And in involving them, are you going to be able to actually provide them with the pathways to do the things that they want to do as opposed to what you as an org want them to do? Are you going to be creating a new program specifically, or can you remix something that already exists to better support a YPAR method? Are you as an org already attached to a particular issue, field, or focus? And so in that case, that's not necessarily a negative per se, but it's more so that you have to be upfront and naming that to the students who are going to be joining you, and you would be providing them with specific context and knowledge building as it relates to that issue as you go out the process as well, and helping them narrow down particular parts of that to then lead their own project upon. Great. So getting into the process overview, YPAR itself is generally a 5 to 6 step process, starting with outreach and recruitment, going into capacity building. So kind of similar to the knowledge building I just mentioned in terms of context for issues that maybe exist that you want to focus on as an org, and that they're interested in learning more about as youth leading their own projects. Research stage, so defining an issue, learning more about it, seeing the impacts that it has in their communities and that it has on them as youth. Developing campaign initiatives to then target those issues and their impacts, and then evaluating and reflecting upon the entire process and seeing how it all came to fruition, and if they're able to target what they kind of had in mind from the beginning. Starting with the first step of outreach. So this page is about actually getting your participants to join your program. So depending on how you as an org are structured and like your path for getting you to join your YPAR program specifically, you may not need this step, but in the event that you are going about it, it's essentially about how you're finding a target audience and getting the word out to them about who you are and what you plan to do. So how are you reaching out to the youth? How are you finding them? What materials are you using to go about that process? So how are you actually marketing the program? How are you getting information about you in front of them? And then how are you laying out the expectations, what you can expect in joining the group? So what can they look forward to experiencing? What can they look forward to doing? And a particular aspect of outreach and recruitment that's really important to keep in mind is actually what criteria you may or may not have for youth to then go about joining you, and how that criteria, if you have it, is potentially going to be exclusionary. So if you have applications, for example, why do you have them? Do you actually need them? Is the method for the application process something that students are familiar with, and that is accessible to them to actually use and create whatever materials they need to apply with? Are there any potential barriers as it relates to transportation from the students getting to you and being able to participate in events? Or as I mentioned earlier, the aspect of scheduling the meeting. So one thing that comes up often is like youth councils as a way of like engaging YPAR. And with that, it's great to bring them into that, to have like a seat on the board, so to speak, for you to participate on. But at that time, block where the council or the board is meeting conflicts with like school, they aren't able to actually participate in it. And so that you have a barrier right there that's impacting their ability to do what you say that you want them to be involved in. Also, do you have like any incentives for you to actually participate in your program? So as you mentioned in the structure, under the structure section of the Jamboard, like, are you able to value their time to kind of increase their willingness to participate with you, whether that's through volunteer hours, through school credit, or by offering stipend of some sort? The next step would be capacity building. So now that you've done your outreach and you have your youth, how are you actually setting them up to step into power within your spaces? You want to highlight the fact that in this setting, youth themselves are the experts in their own experiences and have ownership over the space, the same way that adult coordinators do, and that you as a group break away from traditional roles of adults as the authority figure decision makers and youth as passive recipients or attendees, and that within the space they have youth actually have the ability to say no, and they will be responsible for driving their projects forward and carrying them out, as opposed to adults deciding what the project will be and like getting roles out to the youth to then do. With capacity building in particular comes a lot of general knowledge building as it relates to the foundational concepts that Adam alluded to earlier, in addition to whatever like issue area that you as an org may be working on, or that you may want to focus on with youth, like hand in hand. And more broadly speaking, as it relates to like general civics, society structures, and how that all influences the issue that, or how that all influences the ability to be impacted by an issue. I see a couple comments in the chat. Apologies. Yeah, exactly. So someone mentioned that they've been in a YPAR setting where students were allowed to call their teachers by their first name instead of saying Miss or Mr. as a way to kind of lessen that power structure and present them as an equal playing field, more friendly, having strong relationships. And that's a great example of like being able of getting rid of that separation of like someone being above someone else. Moving on to the research and assessment stage. We can get into this step. It's about narrowing on the issue to a particular facet that students are interested in learning more about and pursuing. And you will develop some research questions to learn more about that issue and its impacts and how it influences the world around students. Within YPAR, there's no one defined data collection method or like process that you have to follow. It's more so about picking a method or multiple methods depending on interests that students are interested in using and that the adult coordinator can actually facilitate or bring in support to facilitate. Once you have that method in mind, you'll go about defining that process by which to carry it out, and will determine the timeline for doing so, as well as whatever markers you have for the number of responses you want to see, depending on however your method itself is defined. And then you will carry it out. Once you have that data back, you will review that process of collection, like kind of discuss how it went for the students, what the experience was like being researchers in those roles. You will analyze the data that you received, and then you'll develop takeaways to actually start the campaign process and target the issue that students are interested in. Now that you're in the campaign stage, it's about actually picking the type of project that students want to implement based on the data that they saw. So what goal do they have? Are they trying to achieve issue awareness? Do they want to target social norms, or is it some type of policy change that they're looking to impact? Once you kind of have that project goal and those outcomes in mind, you can develop an action plan with the tools that you want to use to actually achieve it and go about that process. And as mentioned earlier, under Common Foundations, a big part of this particular step is actually rehearsal awareness. So similar to the idea of community mapping, you want to figure out who do you as students, who do you as adults know, and what do you know about that can be brought into this process, and that's readily available to you to go about actually doing a particular activity or particular action, and how would that be helpful to you in terms of reaching your goals, and who do you think would be helpful to contact or to be in front of in terms of doing that, in terms of getting to where you want to be. Now that you have your action plan, you'll go into actually implementing your process. So just doing what you said you're going to do and carrying all that out.
Elaine?
Yes.
Quick question. Can you give an example of like an issue that may have been brought up that you've witnessed and that has come into this process and how that looked?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Can you give an example of like an issue that was determined by the youth and how it's gone through this process?
Oh, yeah. So something that comes to mind is one particular youth program that I worked with. They were in environmental club. And so they're really interested about issues of like around the environment and like the world around them. And so they didn't have like a defined issue that they were working on. They're kind of under that general umbrella of the environment. And so in terms of, for example, if I go back, in terms of research and assessment, how they narrow down their issue is actually, they have like a general brainstorming session where students just like name things about the environment that they're interested in learning more about or that they saw around them. So kind of like, what are you seeing in your communities? How's that impacting you? What does that look like? In an ideal world, what would this look like instead type of situation? It's like naming issues off that manner, and then kind of collectively narrowed it down by a like a majority, not a majority vote, but like a general like a voting process wherein students were able to advocate for their particular issue they wanted to focus on and get like buy-in from other groups, from other youth to like support that particular issue. And then this particular group was interested in actually campus littering. And so what they ended up doing was they use observation and surveys as their main two tools. And so one, they wanted to find out how many trash cans are actually on their campus and where they placed, and how far is that placement from places where students usually eat. So like the cafeteria or benches, because those are open campus, and how's that impacting where trash is like falling on our campus. And they wanted to actually count as well the number of like pieces of litter that they saw and in what areas, and how that related to those two things. And their ultimate project goal was to, one, raise awareness about campus littering. And so they wrote a couple of articles in their newspaper about it, and they presented to their admin about where they were seeing trash, how much trash they were seeing, as a way of getting admin to increase the number of trash cans on campus. And also to have their trash cans have lids, because they mentioned it was an open campus, and so like with it being so large, so to speak, and like the wind coming through, like things get tipped over a lot, and then like getting tipped over, you'd have like extra like piles of like rubbish just like hanging out in places that were also impacting the campus appearance. It was a big stuff for admin in terms of how they framed that, of like, well, we don't want litter on our campus and it look bad that we have like trash everywhere. That was their assessment, design, action plan, yeah. And so that was how they went about their process. And then in terms of actually evaluating that, that was 1 year. The second year, because they were a recurring program, they actually compared what the results that they saw of the previous year in terms of how much litter was where, and where the trash cans were implemented, to see if it changed or not.
There was another example too that I heard from a colleague that I really liked. And this one, I guess, is a little bit more New York specific, but it's, I thought it was really interesting. So in Greenpoint, Williamsburg area, there's the Newtown Creek. So it's a site of one of the biggest oil spills in history. And so there's a lot of lead that's in the soil around like McCarran Park and like that whole area, and like McGalrick. And so the kids and facilitators, they teamed up and they were able to do things like community lead testing, and learn about the impact that lead has, and sort of implement the campaign that way. I can get more details, I guess later on. I should have probably thought this through before I gave the example, but this is something too that's a little bit, I guess, beyond the campus walls. So it can be as big and expansive or as local as you want it to be. It doesn't have to be something that's like city or countrywide, and it can be just about any size.
Sounds great, guys. Thanks for sharing that. I'm just curious, Elaine, as far as the trash pickup process, when they did evaluate it the following year, did they see much of a difference and a change?
They did, yeah, because of the fact that the admin actually ended up changing the type of trash cans altogether that they had on campus. And so it wasn't just that they got new trash cans, but that they also got trash cans that like they got like receptacles that trash cans were placed into. And so it was like both like trash cans and recycling bins that were like in-housed. And so that reduced a lot of the litter that was like being kind of flown out of trash cans. And then because there are more than placed around the campus, people weren't just dropping things randomly on the ground. But it had an impact, yes. Are there any other questions from folks about the steps so far? And then, Jock, did you unmute for another question, or is that just a?
No, I was just going to say.
Oh, okay. Sure, yeah, of course. So campaign design, so kind of designing, again, going over the project goals, your outcomes that you want to see from whatever you do, and then actually doing the things in campaign implementation. And then you kind of round out the entire process with an evaluation and reflection step. So one, looking specifically at your action plan, what you intended to do, and like, did you do it? And to what extent did you do it? And then reflecting on like the outcomes that you saw and how that compared to the goals that you had in mind at the very beginning of the process. and then also reflecting on the experience of doing things that you said that you're going to do. So how did the roles work out? Were people able to actually do their individual tasks? Were there ways that you could have done the tasks differently that could have been more helpful, or that could have been just different in general for what you're trying, different in general in terms of achieving your overall goal? How does your overall goal compare to your outcomes? And then lastly, this is usually where you have like some type of student feedback step with regards to like the organization or like the program itself. So kind of looking beyond the actual campaign process and the YPAR process, but like how was the program? How were you treated in it? How did it feel to experience it? Like what were your takeaways as a student coming into this process? Before we move into a general like YPAR and practice kind of overview, for example, sorry, are there any questions about any of the steps at all? Great. So now I want to show you all a video of YPAR in practice. This is actually an example of youth who experienced YPAR at a YMCA in Honolulu.
The YPAR framework is unique in that it's not a program, but it's a process in which the youth go through to become change agents around real issues that they see in their community. So it can be used in any program.
So our YPAR program, Youth Participatory Action Research, we do things to help our community and the communities around us that maybe don't have a YMCA, so like Wahiwa. And the way we implemented it into our Y is by making a garden. With the plants that we're growing here, we hope to take to a certified kitchen, which we're still communicating with and we're waiting for them to get back to us. And then we'll take that food and that's what we'll put in our brown bags for next time we go to Wahiwa. And we'll feed the homeless with food that we have helped to grow and create. So then we're really impacting the communities around us.
I think YPAR has impacted me by giving me a different point of view in my life and the way I see my community. Notice more things that be improved and positive things that people do in the community.
We hope to achieve a long-lasting garden that we can be able to feed everyone in Kailua, hopefully, and move away from relying on food from outside and being shipped in. I've learned more of the healthy lifestyle, so I've been eating the kalo we've been growing and the papayas from down there, and coconuts. I love coconut.
I have specific participants who are youth that come to the garden that we are a partner with YPAR and the Y at our school. And we have troubled youth that come up to our garden who have a really difficult time being successful in the academic environment. But when they get into the garden, it's just their spirit lights up. They have tasks that they're inspired to do on their own admission, and it's just amazing the projects that we work on there and the relationships that we build, and it's been tremendous for their self-confidence and for them to see themselves as leaders.
I am most proud of the teams that we work with. In all honesty, I love the work we do, and I'm from the community of Waimanalo, so it feels good to help start a community garden in Waimanalo. And I am of Hawaiian descent, so it feels real good to be involved with the Ulupo Heao and learning about my culture. But ultimately, the thing I'm most proud of is seeing the change that the teens can make. When teens and other people do stuff for the community, it is an outward reflection, but really the inward reflection they get about themselves and what they can do gives them pride that they couldn't get anywhere else. The reaction from the community has been super positive. Beyond the schools that we work with and the different organizations that we work with, the word has spread throughout the community in a positive light. We are now looked at as a resources that schools and churches and other nonprofits can go to and either participate with us or learn our structure, the YPAR structure, so that they can adapt it to their staff, to their children, to any of their projects that they're working with.
The one word that I would use to sum up the YPAR program is amazing, because, and I know that's a really broad term, which is perfect because it fits into everything. It's amazing because we're helping give back. It's amazing because I have grown with the people I love and care about. It's amazing because it has taught us not only leadership responsibility, it's shown us the leadership potential we have, but it's also shown us that we can make a difference in our communities.
So in addition to that YMCA example, this slide also includes links to see other projects that youth have carried out in case you're interested in getting a sense of the different possibilities that YPAR can actually impact upon the youth. I believe Adam dropped those into the chat. And so as we head into our break, feel free to review the links or like come back to it later to pursue. We'll be breaking for 10 minutes. Right now it is 12:55, so we'll be back, I'm sorry, 1:55, so we'll be back at 2:05. But yes, thank you.
Also, if you haven't submitted your attendance, please just click on the form there and complete it. If you have any trouble like seeing, just let us know. Enjoy your break.
And we are now officially back from our break. So thank you all for rejoining, first of all. After taking that first hour to talk about YPAR specifically, we now want to talk about the bucket of youth adult partnerships, also known as YAPs, with YPAR just one particular structure. So YAPs. As the name would imply, YAPs are simply a partnership between youth and adults that's defined by the ways in which they are able to engage with one another. In positive YAPs, youth and adults are both equally involved, share power, and are expected as being capable of meaningful decision making. However, not all YAPs are positive and not all are meaningful for youth who are participating in them.
Great. And so there are 3 conditions that should be met, I guess, before, embarking upon a youth-adult partnership. So the first would be adults need to be willing to share their power and responsibility with young people. And young people also need to be willing to take on the responsibility. So this is a two-way street. And it involves developing a pretty strong relationship between adults and participants so that they can both communicate their needs to one another. And the third reason is that both of these groups need the skills to successfully work together. And so next up is the difference between meaningful and non-meaningful participation. So I think it's important to point out that a program won't necessarily have only meaningful or only non-meaningful participation. Usually it's a combo. It's, there's a little bit of both, or perhaps there's more one than the other. This is just kind of a good framework to look at when you're putting together a youth adult partnership. Are you incorporating meaningful youth participation? I just don't want people to think that, I don't know, if their program doesn't have all meaningful youth participation, that's not a meaningful program. That's not what it means. It's just it's just a descriptor of the different kinds. And so non-meaningful youth participation, so young people would be involved in programs, activities, and organizations, but there are some core elements missing. So for example, they don't have youth voice. Their freedom of choice is limited. So they're only able to make kind of superficial decisions about, like, let's say, picking the color of something, but not being able to direct the activity itself. And just generally a lack of decision-making power. Information sharing isn't really done. So there's not that transfer of knowledge from youth to adults and adults to youth. And there's limited responsibility. So youth aren't given that full amount of responsibility from adults. Adults are taking the reins and not really letting up any control. And by contrast, meaningful youth participation. So young people are seen as experts. Young people can participate on equal terms with adults or work independently in organizations or in the stages of programming and policy making. Things like designing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating the programs. And so mechanisms have to be in place for young people to have an active role and in which their voices are heard and respected. So I think an important thing also to keep in mind is that it's keeping it developmentally appropriate. So if the kids are younger, of course, scaffolding. Even if they're older, I mean, young people don't necessarily have the opportunity to really flex these muscles very often, particularly in an educational setting. So making sure that youth feel supported, yet also feel empowered to independently participate.
So one way of visualizing meaningful participation and the different ways in which it can be expressed and experienced through YAPs is through the flower of participation, which you can see on this particular slide. It showcases the 5 core elements of the participation, that Adam just went over, being freedom of choice, information, voice, responsibility, and decision-making power, as well as soil being commitment from youth. Different types of non-meaningful versus meaningful participation. So looking at the insect versus the leaves and the flower petals themselves, and then also the preconditions for MYP being the enabling environment and then capacity strengthening. Great.
And then the, let's see. So you can see the insects at the bottom being things like tokenism and manipulation. So tokenism is in like having young people participate, but just for the sake of having them there, not really allowing them to make meaningful decisions, or manipulation, kind of forcing their hand or having them make decisions without really giving them a say in the matter. And then some of the parts up top, so for example, like enabling environment and capacity strengthening, those are going to be those organizational preconditions. So things like commitment from adults, policies, financial means, a safe space for you to grow, make mistakes, but also feel empowered to do the work. And also flexibility, and then capacity strengthening, as in like professional development, like you're all doing right now, or building up capacity financially, or in terms of time, in terms of participation, any of that.
I would also add that in terms of the enabling environment in particular, that correlates directly to the culture, structure, and climate that we talked about at the beginning of the webinar, in terms of aspects that you can incorporate or that you should be developing in order to get to that point of having an environment that supports you being able to truly engage. Oh, and additionally, in terms of the flower and how it's represented here, within this particular framework, the flower doesn't necessarily rank the different forms of yaps. It's more so naming how they exist. And so it doesn't put like a judgment call on which ones are better or worse for the youth to experience, which is a contrast to Hart's ladder participation, which actually does rank them on a ladder from like for non-participation, so like the lowest rung being manipulation, all the way to the highest rung, which is youth, young people, and adults shared decision making. You'll notice that on the flower, there were kind of 8 insects, petals, and leaves. And on the rung, on the ladder, there are also 8 rungs. However, on the ladder within Hearts, the petal that was youth adult partnerships is actually the entire ladder. So like Hearts views the ladder, Hearts views youth adult partnerships as like the entire umbrella under which these different things, the different rungs fall, whereas youth adult partnerships are actually like a type of petal on the flower. Additionally, because the fact that like youth adult partnerships are taken out of the ladder, you'll see that to still get those 8 rungs, decoration and tokenism, which were kind of combined together on the flower, are actually separated out here. And so in terms of how this functions, essentially you have non-participation, which is the bottom 3 rungs, and these are all cases of youth being acted upon. And as you go higher and higher up the ladder, you are getting to increase ownership and participation of youth to get to that highest point, which here is depicted as the 8th rung, that these young people and adults sharing decision making, but actually there's a bit of a back and forth between the 7th rung, again, people leading and initiating action, and the 8th rung, that depending on that in terms of which one's truly the pinnacle, since like in both cases you have youth leading and initiating, whereas one is they're doing that in partnership with adults, the other is like they're doing it themselves. I would argue that both the 7th and 8th rung are YPAR, and that kind of like picking which one is truly the better rung kind of comes down to the viewpoint you have on the need for adults in those spaces. But regardless, like YPAR is both of them in terms of youth doing the decision making themselves. As you can see on this ladder, it has the different rungs, their definitions, and the examples. So feel free to take some time to kind of review each of those sections. And I actually would love to hear if there are things that come to mind for you as like direct examples that you are kind of doing in your own work that can correlate to particular examples or particular rungs on the ladder. I know this slide is pretty content heavy, so I'm going to leave it up for a bit. So if it gets quiet, that's why. Great. So I will open space again for questions before we move on, just in case there's anything that stands out here. I think I have one comment in the chat. Yeah, so in terms of getting a copy of this, you'll get a copy of, or you'll get the slides themselves, and then we will also be sharing a folder, a Google Drive folder after the fact that will include all the graphics separately, as well as some other resources on how to actually facilitate, like in terms of how to actually facilitate YPAR, so like toolkits and additional checklists and things like that. And we will also, in our next activity, be dropping in actually this particular graphic as well.
I think one question that is coming up for me, or that has come up with for other people, is, for example, I don't know, these are a lot of best practices and things to all do at once. Is this something that's able to be done gradually or in parts? Or is it like a one-shot deal where you kind of have to go from 0 to 100?
In terms of the flower, the answer is no. So I separate my answer out like that, apologies, sorry, because the flower, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't rank them per se. It's more like picking the particular one that works best for you, as long as it's a meaningful form of participation. But with the latter, I wouldn't necessarily say that you're going through the process, but like you don't necessarily need to go through the process, so to speak, sorry. Maybe like for you, you have like an overarching goal of where you want to be. And so you're going to be able to use the rungs as like a way of getting there, as like you kind of like, you pivot your organizational structures, you try to incorporate more and more aspects of youth participation, youth ownership. But that doesn't mean that you necessarily have to like go up the rungs. It doesn't matter, like, it's just a visual of getting, of naming like where you are and where you want to be, or naming where you want to be, so to speak, in and of itself. And I will have a caveat that like if you're trying to like get like to the highest point of the ladder, that can be difficult in terms of that can be difficult depending on what you actually have in place at the moment in terms of like actually trying to implement that. And so maybe in that case you want to start lower and work your way up, just because of the fact that there's a lot of capacity into those higher rungs. And you have to have a lot of like structures to support like successful delivery of those things. But largely speaking, the answer is no. Are there any other questions from folks? Great. So we have this additional slide specifically about the distinction between gaps and tokenism as a particular form of non-meaningful participation, or like a non-participation in general, just because tokenism in particular can be hard to get away from as a form of non-participation, just because it's really easy for you to simply be brought into a space and have that be viewed as meaningful because they may have not have had access to it beforehand, or they may not have been able to be a part of it beforehand. But that's not always the case, and it can quickly turn into using youth as props, because like you're having them there as this like a figurehead, or as a way to like kind of pat yourself on the back because you did something, but they aren't able to actually engage with it, and there isn't like a true sense of ownership attached to it. Then you're not actually providing any agency or choice, and you're not actually letting them do the things that you say that you want them to do. Especially, and this is the case even more so in terms of whether or not you're able to provide like information sharing throughout that process, in terms of why they're being brought into the space and what the whys of what they're being asked to respond to and what they're being asked to do, and the hows of actually getting that work done. So are you like supporting them and along those steps in terms of doing the things that you are incorporating them into the space for? So this slide is generally, it's more so just a point of reference and seeing like some common examples of youth being brought into spaces under like the guise of gaps or meaningful participation, but not actually being able to do the work itself.
Hey, Lane, just a quick question on, this is a good list actually, that really provides some kind of granular aspect to this in terms of youth voice and some of the tokenism that you may witness out there or feel forced to implement and do. But as far as I list, one of the bullets is like having one youth on a board of directors or council to point to has youth involvement. And I've seen this a number of times too. You have the student body, youth government, or something on the board of youth council. And it looks nice and pretty and it looks cute, but they really don't have a say-so or a process to really make some meaningful decisions in programs and schools and systems. So I remember I used to have conversations around this, but some adults just feel like, well, what are the boundaries with this, and what kind of decisions can youth make when it comes to these kind of environments that can be meaningful? Can you provide some kind of context to that? If you have a youth council, if you have youth a panel or a meeting of youth to make decisions, what are some meaningful decisions that youth can make within programs that can be meaningful to the experience?
In terms of like programs themselves, so not necessarily like the structure of a program, but just like activities. Is that what you're asking?
It could be programs, or it could be a school day as well. But just when these councils are being set up, what are some examples that have you seen or heard to be effective when it comes to youth making decisions?
Yeah, and so in terms of the examples, that's going to vary largely on the organization itself. And so in terms of what capacity the org has to actually incorporate youth input and whatever they're trying to do. And so I think part of this is also not just asking questions to ask them. So if you're not going to be able to actually incorporate the responses that you're getting from the youth in terms of whatever future or continuous improvement you're doing, then that's also from tokenism, and that you're just trying to get a sense, or you're instilling like a facade of ownership over like the space in and of itself. And so you want to make sure that whatever you are asking the youth to respond to, or that you're asking them to take on, is actually going to be incorporated in whatever you're doing next as an organization, and that will actually have an impact on the org itself. And you also want to make sure that in asking youth questions that you're explaining to them, or that you're not explaining, that you're sharing with them why that particular question is being asked, so that they know like how they have a sense of both what the response is going to be used for, but also a general sense of like why they're responding to something, and they'll have like more of a buy-in towards it in terms of giving you like actually giving you meaningful responses that can then lead to like a betterment of some type. In terms of specific examples, so for I'm thinking of like a student advisory council for a school, and so I'm thinking of a youth advisory council for a school board, sorry. And so in that particular setup, they were bringing in youth from different schools and having them attend board meetings as a way of like getting youth voice at the actual meetings and having input over action items for the district. And so in that particular sense, they wanted to make sure they were asking students to review the agendas beforehand, ask questions that sharing questions that they had about what's showing up on the agenda and why it was happening, and then provide commentary during the meetings that could then be incorporated into whatever decisions that they're going to be making as they kind of determine what to do next, what to do next for those actions. And so that can go one of two ways. So positively is when you're actually going to take that into account and you're going to actually incorporate the responses of the youth into your decisions. Or it can just be like you're asking a question just to ask it like on a public stage, and then you're just going to discard all the information. So that's an example of tokenism. You don't want to be doing that, because that's not going to be meaningful for the youth if you're going to ask them to go through this entire process of like both getting on the board, responding to the reviewing the agenda items, getting understanding what all this means, and then not having like any outcomes attached to it. I'm not sure if that actually answered your question, because I was kind of spoke broadly at the beginning of it, but I hope that helped. Or I can also elaborate.
Right, no, it's a good response. I think it's important too that when you do have these youth councils, and you stated earlier as well, is that their youth are informed about what's happening as well, so they can give a certain perspective on it. I think sometimes we just have them as fixtures to this tapestry of what we're doing after school. But when we actually say, hey, here's what the information is, being transparent, then they can make some quality decisions on how they can move forward. Sometimes I have a youth panel and we sit down together and say, hey, what do you envision about after school program? And they're going upon the context of what they've experienced in the past. And it's hard for them to make future decisions without being exposed to all the other options and opportunities and other activities and enrichments that are out there. So they kind of go with the status quo. But when we provide them with more information, then they can make stronger and more meaningful decisions that could really change and alter the culture of a school environment or after school kind of experience. Just wanted to share that. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ties in really well with the aspect of not necessarily community mapping, but it's like a general resource awareness. And so getting a sense of like in an ideal world, like what you know aside, like what do you want this like instead, and how can we potentially like get that into place for you so that you're able to experience the experiences that you actually want to have, which is a common tool used in YPAR in terms of community visioning exercises, kind of reviewing what exists, what you would rather have, not rather have it, but what would you also like to have or have instead, and how can you kind of like get to that point in time or get to that space.
I got a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, so could someone there talk about the importance of, I'm new in this position here, and what I notice is that when we have group gatherings, especially with our middle school students, there doesn't seem to be a lot of cohesion in when they first come in because there's tables everywhere, they're on their cell phones. I was talking to one of the leaders about maybe having the group come together for like maybe 4 minutes or 5 minutes or so in a circle group. Could you speak to that, the importance of maybe doing that at the beginning of some of our gatherings with these middle school students?
Sure. What you just described is actually a very common practice in terms of relationship building in both YPAR and Gaps overall. And so kind of like the general culture setting, the space setting that you're doing for your programs. And so an example that would be like having like check-ins or icebreakers, or like you mentioned the circle talks, or mentioned circles, having like a guided circle talk as a way of opening the space like consistently can help with general like getting to know one another and feeling comfortable in being with one another and like sharing your actual thoughts. So like building up to the point of having you feel comfortable interact with one another, and interacting with students they may not know, as opposed to just like kind of dropping them in and expecting them to be able to feel comfortable doing those things. Because you need to have a sense of familiarity to actually like share your true opinions and like to feel comfortable in sharing them and to feel like you'll actually be heard when you're doing so. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Are there any other questions before we move on about anything so far? So now we're going to go into breakouts. I believe Adam just dropped into the chat both Hearts Ladder and the flyer participation. So what we're going to do is, now that you have both those graphics, we're going to split you up into breakout rooms where you will be able to pick one of the two that you as a group will collectively focus on. And as an individual, you will determine where you as an organization or where a particular part of your organization, what's like a program in your org, falls on either one of the graphics, and kind of answer one prompt or one main prompt, which is essentially where do you fall? Sorry, is that where you want to be? And if so, why do you want to be there? What about it works for you? And then if not, where do you want to be instead? And how can you potentially get there? So it'll be a bit of self-reflection, some sharing out, and then kind of brainstorming together around how you kind of get to where you want to go and do things that you want to do. I can drop those prompts into the chat, I believe. And then Adam, can you open the breakout rooms? Or can you create the breakout rooms? Sorry.
Yep. Let's see. I just want to make them even. All right, perfect.
Great, sorry. So I was putting some of the comments in the chat, but we can also broadcast them out to people who are still here. So feel free to go ahead and join your rooms now.
It didn't let me assign myself to one, but I'll join room 3 and Jug, if you want to join one, you can do room 1. If you don't want to, that's okay.
Sure, I can join room 1.
And then Elaine, I put you in room 2, if that's okay.
How long is this breakout?
Apologies, it'll be about 10 minutes. I can broadcast that to the group or to all the rooms.
Okay, 10 minutes.
Was I supposed to be all alone in room 2?
No, I'm not sure why. I think people haven't joined your room yet. So hopefully they will hop over.
Okay.
If not, I can try and get Adam to reassign you somewhere else.
Okay, no worries. I can rejoin.
Is anybody having difficulties getting to the breakout room, or are you calling in separately?
All right, we'll give everybody a few more seconds and they should be coming in.
Yeah. Okay, so I hope you all had some time in your breakouts to talk a bit about where you are and what kind of like your future envisionings. Essentially, sorry. Future visioning, sorry. Okay, sorry, apologies. The idea was essentially kind of like talk through what you can do and like brainstorm a bit about like kind of how you can get to where you want to go.
Great. And so then here's a few recommendations that we just kind of pulled from a handout, or I guess like a PDF packet that we'd be sending out to you guys in the Google Drive link. And so some big ones that popped out to us were commitment is key. So really taking the time to commit to this, to really, I mean, this is something that's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take a lot of effort. It's going to really take a lot of buy-in from everybody involved. Taking the time to build relationships. So this is incredibly important because it involves really close communication between youth and adults, and it involves a relationship strong enough for people to really say what they need in that moment. So for example, like if a young person feels like, you know, this is too much work for me right now, or the adult thinks, okay, well, this isn't going as well as I'd hoped, or it's not going the direction I thought it would. Being able to have that relationship, that bedrock to kind of build upon, is essential. Being flexible in everything you do. I think it goes without saying that all of you have been incredibly flexible over the past couple of years, and just generally, of course, even before COVID. After school is where flexibility happens. Establishing clear roles and expectations. So young people don't necessarily know what it's like to be asked to participate in something this way. I know that if I were in my after school program and somebody asked me like meaningfully what I was thinking or what I wanted to do for a project, I'm not sure I would know. I think that that clear expectation and really teaching the roles and working through everything on how you can work together best is important. Striving for funding. So this is hard. I feel like in education and after school and just generally, money is never in high enough supply. So I guess setting aside funding, or just generally resources, whether it's time, physical materials, or like manpower, to really give people these opportunities, to give young people the built-in opportunities to participate meaningfully. And then finally, creating ways to really listen, give feedback, and build accountability. So this will look different across each organization. And it'll look different based on the project that you're working on, or like the age of the students that you're working with, but ways that are built into the program itself so that you can continue to communicate and hold one another accountable. So that would be a two-way street. So not just adults holding youth accountable, but also the other way around if adults don't follow through. And I believe that's all the ones on there. Let's see. I think that's it for that one.
So in terms of determining which YAP works best for you, or which partnership rather works best for you, there are, as we've seen so far, lots of different youth to participate and to be in partnership with adults. And so the considerations that you may have in place in terms of determining which one works best for your particular organization could depend on a variety of different reasons in terms of your capacity, your time, your funding, or whatever objectives you may have in place that might be attached to a program. And so that might mean that only that certain types of gaps or partnerships would be best suited for what you're trying to do and for how you're able to engage with the youth. And so here are a couple of like questions that can help guide that process in terms of determining, in terms of realizing the factors that you have in place that will influence that choice. It's more of an overview slide. If there are particular ones that stand out to you, I think Adam actually covered a few in his earlier slide, but it's just more so of a way of visualizing all the different things that would go into determining which particular gap would work best for you. Kind of nudging you closer to whichever one is your ideal fit, so to speak. So that was actually our last slide. If you have any particular questions, we can visit the Jamboard. I'm not sure if there are any on there as of right now. So if you want to like go in and add a couple of last minute ones, feel free to take the time now. And as well, in this particular Google Drive folder, you will see both the slides for today's webinar, as well as a slide for the graphics that we were handed out and that were included in the slides separately, in addition to some additional toolkits around conceptualizing gaps and YPAR further and kind of evaluating where you are in your process and kind of where you want to go and how you can facilitate it all. As well, Adam just dropped in the link to both the Drive and the evaluation survey for this webinar, so if you can take that, that would be great. Let us know how we did, what you thought about it, and if you have any questions, as mentioned earlier, you have our information from the earlier slide you will be receiving after the fact. Any last minute comments or thoughts from anyone? Great. Thank you for coming to today's webinar and for your time and spending the last 2 hours with us. Hopefully you're able to upload something that you found helpful, that will be useful to you in the future. But yes, thank you so much.
I want to add really
Thank you so
quickly.
much, everybody.
Sorry, thank you. I'll be sending out a follow-up email with the resources, just so you're aware. So you'll have these links and some of the other documents that were referenced earlier in the session. Thank you, Adam and Elaine, and thank you all for joining us for today. Stay tuned for the next one on the 25th. All right, have a good day.